Do you know who St. Ignatius is?
Absolutely not.
Not really sure.
No.
No, I do not.
I used to. I don't know anymore.
He founded Jesuitness, Jesuitity, Jesuitality, I don't know.
Ignatius Loyola. He's the guy who founded the Jesuits.
You can't separate Jesuit education from St. Ignatius, from his vision of the world, from the ultimate question that he was asking, which is basically, who am I in light of us being creatures of God? They got to know who he is, St. Ignatius. They got to know, why this place was founded, and they got to know something of the passion that he had that he wanted to pass on to others.
Ignatius was born into a family of minor nobility in Spain. As a young man, being born into that type of family structure, he was himself very ambitious. He wanted to become a knight, if you will, to be outstanding in the service of the king and country. His approach, therefore, was one of ambition, and through some distant relatives, he was brought to court as a page and gradually began to work his way up the ladder of chivalry.
He apparently is only the only saint to have a notarized police record for brawling. So he was something of a hothead.
In an attempt to distinguish himself so that he would rise further, he came to Pamplona to defend the town against the French who were invading and led this suicidal raid, in effect, that everyone admitted, including the French, was totally futile.
He found himself sort of on the parapets of a castle, and a cannonball shattered his leg.
The French were so impressed with the fight that Ignatius put up at Pamplona that they had their own doctors work on him there before they sent him back home. But they didn't do the best job. When he got back home to Loyola, they realized that the way they had kind of set the bone, he was going to walk with a limp, and he had too much pride in his appearance and how he was going to come off.
And so he submitted himself to a series of operations that were pretty painful just to make his leg look nice in the tights that they used to wear at the time.
It was a matter of vanity. They had no anesthetic. There was no way of really diminishing the pain involved. But of course, it protracted his recovery, his convalescence.
The sense that I have of Ignatius when he's convalescing at home would be like a kid who has been playing video games all their life, and suddenly they don't have access to their Game Boy, and what am I going to do to kind of amuse myself? And the only thing they have are these books, and it's the Life of Christ, and another one is the Life of the Saints.
He realized when he was reading this book about the lives of the saints that when he thought about following the lives of St. Francis and St. Dominic and thinking about the Gospels, he would be very excited, and afterwards he would still have that feeling of excitement and peace. But when he thought about doing something a little more worldly, while those things made him excited, afterwards he was left feeling a little dry. And so he started to weigh these things and thought that maybe that was the way that God was drawing him. And that was the beginning of Ignatian spirituality. He started to think that those different sort of pulls on you, those different kinds of, as he called them, spirits, were ways of discerning God's will in his life.
Somehow it stirred some idealism within him, and he was led to kind of go on a journey to discover really what it was that he was supposed to be doing with his life.
What he decided he wanted to do, specifically, was to go to the Holy Land and to serve pilgrims there. And so, in time, he left Loyola, much against his family's wishes. He went to the Benedictine monastery at the top of the Montserrat Mountains, which are like Sawtooth Mountains. That's why it's called Montserrat. And there is a beautiful monastery of the Benedictines, and it has as its main piece the Black Madonna. And that night, he spent the whole night kneeling in front of Our Lady's altar, and he presented his sword and left it as an ex voto offering, symbolizing his change of life, that he was now going to devote his life to Christ. When he left the church, he saw a beggar sitting right outside who was dressed in rags. And he said to the beggar, "I'd like to exchange clothes with you." And he gave the beggar all of his courtly clothes and took the rags the beggar had. And Ignatius started off when there was a big shouting match, etc. And the police came up to him and said, "Sir, do you know this man?" And they pointed to the beggar, who was now dressed in finery. And he said, "Yes." And he said, "Did he steal your clothes?" And he said, "No, I gave them to him."
A nobleman who had it all, who gave it all up because he wanted to be in relationship with God and because he was willing to be treated as the teacher treats the schoolboy.
In a lot of ways, what his agenda is to reinvent himself, which a lot of our students do when they come to university for the first time. It's like, for the first time in my life, I'm away from my parents. I don't have them, or not only my family, but I don't necessarily even have the friends that sort of pigeonholed me and like only used to think of me a certain way, and it gives them an opportunity like, well, who do I want to be? It really is the time in their lives where they are beginning to own the person that they're going to be.
I'll ask questions. I'll ask them either in class or individually. It's like, what's the meaning of life? You know? And it was immediately I was like, whoa, man, if you're not going to ask that question when you're in college, if you're not going to start to ask that question, then how are you going to live through the rest of your life? That's the point. You know, what is the meaning of life? What's the meaning of your life?
One of the deep values of the liberal arts is that it's constantly in the business of asking that question, what's the meaning of life, not only in the humanities and in the social sciences, but in the physical sciences as well. What's the nature of this reality that we're embedded in? And what does our embeddedness in it tell us about ourselves and our relationship to it and our responsibilities within it?
They have to be encouraged to see life as an unfolding adventure in which they will never cease discovering everything about themselves and about all of reality.
After he finishes at Montserrat, he wants to get to the Holy Land. And as he leaves there, he stops in a nearby town with the name of Manresa.
He wanted to pray for a bit, and he went to one of the caves and he prayed there, but actually that time stretched out to a year, during which time he engaged in prayer and kept notes on his prayer. And those notes became the basis for the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius.
Part of the genius of what Ignatius does in the exercises is, like, it's one thing to have religious experiences, to have spiritual experiences of God. And people have them all the time. You know, we can have these experiences and then want to tell people what it was like and want to share that. But what Ignatius does is he actually figures out a way to help people to have the experience that he had. He comes up with these ways of praying that actually allows them to experience the same thing.
He wanted to be a signpost pointing the way. He wanted to communicate his experience in such a way as to be helpful, but he never wanted to impose his experience on someone else or insist that this is the only way to get to know the Lord. He provided a great way, which I think worked really well for me and for people of my experience, but he never said this is the only way to get there.
The first part of the exercises is about how much you are loved by God, by the one who created you. You were created in love. You are sustained with every breath that you take, the next one including, in that same love, and you will go to the very end of your life and beyond in that love. It's almost like St. Ignatius recognized as he created these exercises that this was the start and ultimately the finish of it all.
Ignatius helps us to raise serious questions about, what is it that really makes one happy? What is God calling me to? Which may be very different from the person who lives next door or whatever. And with great respect, to help a person to explore alternatives.
If you let your guard down, and especially in this world that we live in, if you let the busyness and the noise and everything else kind of just stop for a second, it's sometimes almost impossible not to at least, see the curtain part for a second and see, wait a minute, and then it floods in, it just floods in. And you can do one of two things. You can either pay attention to that or you can run away from it.
He really encourages explicit attention to, what are my desires? What are my hopes? What are the things that really give me problems? When am I really disquieted about something, and why? In order to explore the whole of human experience and not just ideas or concepts, etc. along the way.
The exercises invite us to become aware of our deepest motivations, the things that give us joy, the things that help us meet our own needs. And the idea is that in the process, as we become more fully ourselves, we become more able to give ourselves to others, to give ourselves to our students, our colleagues, our disciplines, our institutions.
I think in many ways a lot of the inspiration for Jesuit higher education comes from the exercises. I think there's an idea that both the director and the directee, the teacher and the student, are loyal in a sense to some higher truth, some higher reality, whether we call that the spirit or the subject matter that both are trying to engage with. Also, of course, the spiritual director pays a lot of attention to the experience of the directee under the inspiration of the Spirit. So too the teacher in Jesuit pedagogy pays a lot of attention to the way in which the student takes and understands the lesson, tries to apply it to his or her own life, and tries to put it into action in some appropriate way.
The animating dynamic of a Catholic and Jesuit university is the spirituality. And to be able to couple that with the craft of teaching, I think is when we're at our very, very best.
I don't know how you do not touch back to, you don't reinsert yourself back into Ignatius. I don't know how you don't go back to the cave with him and somehow have the experience.
And one afternoon he went out for a walk, and running through the town is a little river called the Cardinere. He was tired and he sat beside the river, just sort of looking at it. And he said at that moment he had an understanding. He said it was not a vision, but it was an opening of his understanding, of his mind, to something that was quite important. He says, if I were to weigh the importance of all of the graces I have received in my life on one side of a scale, and on the other I put just this one grace I received in this understanding that came at the Cardinere, that understanding would outweigh everything else I've received as grace during my life. And the understanding that he came to was that God could be found in all things. That God was not simply found in a church or a monastery or in moments of prayer, but God could be found in the marketplace, among common people. God could be found on the streets. God could be found wherever God's creation existed.
What Ignatius began there is an understanding of God as ongoing discovery, that in the ordinary events of life, God is continuing to reveal God's self, God's presence, God's direction, God's design. And what it calls for is that we allow that to happen.
Nothing was ever going to be the same again, and he didn't know where it was going to take him. And in fact, he probably thought initially that he was going to be going completely against what anyone ever expected of him.
It's hard to know exactly what happened to him, but really I think the point is what happened to him made him so confident of God's love in his life and God's care for him that it basically strengthened him for the rest of his life.
He gets to Barcelona. He begs in the cathedral in the old Barrio Gótico. And he begged the money to use to get passage on a ship to the Holy Land. He got there, and he only had opportunity to be in Jerusalem because the whole country was really controlled by the Muslims. He went out into the streets and began to preach Christ.
He went there with the idea he wanted to convert people. There was an agreement with the Vatican that the sort of official custodians of Catholic Christian holy places were the Franciscans. They saw Ignatius as being a dangerous guy, that he was so full of zeal, of energy and passion and enthusiasm for wanting to convert people that he was blind to the idea that he could get himself killed.
And the Franciscans immediately got on top of him and said, look, you're going to get yourself killed, you'll get other people killed too, because there's a lot of persecution, etc. Ignatius wanted to stay. Finally, they said, you must go. He said he didn't want to. They ordered him under penalty of sin, and finally he left and went back.
I think for us looking back at Ignatius going with all of this zeal to the Holy Land, what we would say to him is, you know, Ignatius, you need to, first of all, know what the situation is that you're getting into. You have to know something about these people that you want to convert. And you have to be willing to treat them with a kind of a respect.
Religion is a part of life, whether you yourself are religious or not. And if somehow or another you don't understand and integrate religious experience into your overall understanding of the world, you've missed a very, very important part of what the world is.
I think as we look at our present cohort of students, whether they're Catholics or non-Catholics, and we look at the world into which we are graduating those students, there are few things that are going to be more important in their adult lives than an ability to relate well to people of other religious beliefs.
I really feel that one of the things we have to do in the United States, where we're freer to do it, is to get Jews, Christians, and Muslims to talk to each other on ethical issues, on political issues, away from the actual front lines of violence in the Middle East, but in an academic setting where we can possibly see some of the continuities as well as be clear about the discontinuities between our religious traditions.
The Jesuit tradition is immensely powerful in its ability to bring that conversation about, to foster that conversation.
I think people feel, wrongly, in my judgment, that to be Catholic is to be kind of static and to affirm, let's say, static ideas that have been ready-made.
The terrible, terrible thing in our time is that we have lived Catholicism in such a way that people could look at something that should be liberating and see it instead as enslaving and deadening. That's the tragedy.
The Jesuit understanding of Catholicism is probably more orthodox than most because we have taken the name Jesus in kind of a scandalous way into the very name of our organization, the Society of Jesus. And the point is that we are supposed to, in some ways, live and model that sort of radical embrace, loving embrace of the world that God has given us. That's not really actually a safe thing to do. And education ultimately is not a safe thing to do. If you're going to follow the truth, wherever it takes you, then you better be willing to sacrifice some things, especially security.
We really have a challenge to expand people's understanding of what Catholicism is about, especially in its intellectual aspect.
He was giving the exercises often, and he was to stand on the corners and preach to people in different cities in Spain. And of course, this was the time when the Inquisition was quite active in Spain, and immediately he was suspect.
They thought his type of prayer, which emphasized, really direct sort of communication between you and God, was really threatening because, where's the church in all of this? And so they threw him in jail.
He was imprisoned a number of times and examined by people from the Inquisition. And each time they said, we find nothing here that's unorthodox, but as a matter of fact, unless you have a master's degree in theology, you cannot do this.
In a sense, this was part of the very atmosphere of the 16th century. The war against ignorance and superstition, especially among the clergy and for the clergy, was widespread, Protestants and Catholics.
Ignatius was, the original adult education person, At the age of 35, he is able to kind of swallow that pride of his and sit in a classroom with kids, just suck it up, as it were, to learn the Latin that he needed to learn so that he could go on to school.
Ignatius's goal that he wanted to get from his education was very clear to him. He wanted to be able to spread the gospel to people everywhere, and he realized that he needed a credible credential to do that. He was told that he had to. He couldn't do it otherwise.
He began his, you might say, his conversion experience with the idea of abandoning the world and sort of contempt of the world, and eventually saw this was not working, and that it did not help him and did not help souls.
He began to recognize that this business of wearing ratty clothes and growing your hair and your nails long was repulsing people. And so he cleaned himself up.
Meanwhile, he'd been at the University of Alcalá, which was a new university, but a very important one and pivotal one in Spain, then Salamanca.
The system, if you will, within the universities, in just about all of the universities, was what was called the modus italicus. They taught a subject in a 3-year cycle. So if you happened to get there when the cycle was beginning, well and good. But if you arrived when they were going into the 3rd year of the cycle and you had no background, you were just tossed into the system, and of course you'd be lost. That was the experience that Ignatius had at the University of Alcalá and at a couple of the other universities in Spain. He heard, however, from some people that there was a totally new approach to education, which was being used at the University of Paris.
These techniques, which were so fundamental that today we can't imagine education without them, that is to say, students should be divided into classes, they move along progressively, that active participation is essential.
It was this concept of scope and sequence that was one of the hallmarks of the modus parisiensis, as opposed to the modus italicus.
And therefore, he goes eventually to the most prestigious academic institution of the day, the University of Paris. So I think what we see in him is it's a real reconciliation with the world, in a sense, in order to help souls better. This thought that education was a help was deep in him. And I think this is the fundamental background to why and how the society got into education.
The reason why I am excited to be in college is because I'm really finding myself. The person I was when I was a senior in high school is completely different than the person I was when after my first semester here, and it's completely different. That person's completely different from who I am now, and I'm probably going to keep changing, and then eventually, hopefully, I'll be the kind of person that I hope to be someday.
Here's your chance to explore and see who you are without having people tell you who you are.
To learn new things and make your own decisions and sort of find yourself in what you believe as opposed to what you've been influenced to believe.
These 4 years are the prime of your life, when you're still getting everything together. You haven't set yourself in one particular path going any particular way, and you're still open to everything.
What do we all have in common is we're all sort of looking for, I don't know, that future us.
One of the reasons why learning is so important is that it allows this continuing, this emergence, this evolution to unfold, and it gives us an opportunity to be part of that unfolding.
It's difficult to get them to kind of step back because there's such an insecurity, I think, in their own identity of, who do I want to be as a person, and kind of pouring everything into, a professional identity before having a sense of where they want to go as people.
I think that it's wrong for students or for the institution to encourage them to think that, well, what they're here for is for a major, to get a job, or for a major just to pursue a particular interest. That major is certainly a very important part of their own professional development and their own moral and ethical and aesthetic development and so on. But it's in a world. And the purpose of the core curriculum is to help to delineate the characteristics of the world in which they will pursue whatever it is they pursue.
They know they want to have a career or a vocation when they graduate, but they're also coming to a school that is different from other schools, and that is Jesuit and Catholic. If they wanted to get a business education, there are plenty of fine secular universities, both state and private, around that they can do that at. So clearly they want something different, something more.
Ideally, I'd like our universities to be places of moral and spiritual formation for our students. Often that's not something we can orchestrate through the classroom, but it is something that we can offer and support in many co-curricular ways in our students, and nurture the ways in which they find that in each other.
What I really have experienced is they are deep seekers, and they are far more than we were deeply concerned about values, about the way that the world ought to be, and convinced that they have a responsibility for the world.
One of the reasons that I think parents pay as much money as they do for Jesuit private education is because they think that somehow or another their son or daughter is going to emerge a better person from this experience. And that better person is a person who has had a more integrated, holistic experience of education, in which they've been able to develop personally through the experience of education, become a more integrated person, in which they've been able to develop a set of values that they understand and believe in because they know where those values come from, and in which they've been able to make important decisions about their lives based on a sense of who they are, of what's important, and of what they want to do with their lives.
To me, the spiritual quest and the intellectual quest are so profoundly intertwined that I would hardly know how to tease them apart.
For Ignatius and for his first companions when he got to the University of Paris we lived with, they were focusing on theology as a way of not only improving themselves, but being able, in effect, to share the gospel with others. Priesthood was not immediately within the purview of Ignatius, even when he was studying in Paris.
This is the beginning of Christian humanism. So part of what Ignatius learns when he's at Paris is a real esteem for what today we would call the classics, the philosophy, the science of people from the ancient world, ancient Greece and ancient Rome, people that certainly in his day would have been called by Christians pagans. Yet there was this kind of openness to truth in general, that even though this truth might have been first articulated or discovered by people we would consider to be pagans or non-believers, there's something universally true about this, and so we can learn from this.
One of his roommates is Francis Xavier, who the world would know later as a great saint. And another one is Peter Faber.
Ignatius apparently had this incredible ability to make friends. So much so that he could get them to consider doing this retreat experience that he had developed. By the time they graduated, there were 10 of them that had all gone through this experience, all of whom had been really changed and affected by it, to the point where they wanted it to affect the rest of their lives. They make this agreement that they want to get to the Holy Land. They want to do great things for God. We want to lead people closer to God, and we also recognize that we need to take care of them. So if they're sick, we need to help them to get better. If they're hungry, we need to feed them. At the time, the only way that you could get to the Holy Land was through Venice. So they agree when they're in France that we'll make our way to Venice and we'll give ourselves a year to try to get to the Holy Land. And while we're waiting, we'll do the kinds of things that we want to do anyway, but we'll do where we are. So tutoring kids that need some education, feeding people, preaching, hearing confessions, sacramental kinds of things too.
Gradually, they started to think that they should start a little religious order. If they didn't know what to do, they went to the Pope to say, where should we go?
Up to that time, the only form of religious were monastic religious. They lived in a monastery. Their main role was the prayer of the hours. Ignatius said, no, the needs of the people of God are so great that what we want to do is to be available to be of service to others in their needs. Bring the good news of the gospel, not only in word but in deed, to them. Initially, there was tremendous opposition to this within the Vatican because they had never heard of religious life other than monastic life. But it was Ignatius's view that God can be found in all things that motivated this. And ultimately, the Pope agreed to allow us to become an apostolic religious community rather than a monastic religious community. And we were the first in the history of the Church. The Jesuits were.
I see another side of Ignatius. Ignatius the bureaucrat, or Ignatius the administrator. He was incredible as a successful administrator, governing a worldwide operation through letters, and he did it so well that the format that he established works quite well today. When I read his letters now, I see his flexibility, I see his vision, which he communicated without imposing, inviting people into without saying this is the only way to do it, and doing that when he would rather have been in the streets of Rome teaching catechism. He was a very pastoral man who would much have preferred to have direct hands-on experience with the people of his time who needed help, but he saw the multiplier effect and was terrific at doing that.
The thing that he wanted to do is he just wanted everybody to have that experience that he had in the cave, you know, so he did everything he could to spread that to other people, have them have the direct experience.
This educational piece, as we know so well, was not on the radar screen of the Ten Companions. As a matter of fact, they seem to have taken a stance against even teaching the new recruits to the society. But they had learned some pedagogical techniques in Paris. They learned that if they used these techniques with their own members, the young recruits to the society, the young Jesuits, would learn faster.
He wanted his Jesuits to be educated in all the things that were important, particularly at the time. So philosophy, fine arts, languages, theology especially. And it's a great example, I think, of the seriousness with which Ignatius took the world. It's not a fleeing from the world. Francis of Assisi, for example, didn't want any of his monks or friars to own a book, because Francis used to say, well, if they have a book, they'll want a shelf for their book, and if they have a shelf for their book, they'll want a library, and if they have a library, they'll say, brother, go get me the book, you know. Ignatius was taking things in a little different direction. In order to engage with the world and in order to really mix it up with the world, he knew that the Jesuits, in order to be respected and also in order to understand the world, would have to be educated. And that's continued until today.
They opened the first school because they were asked to do it. They picked up and borrowed these pedagogical techniques and principles known as the Parisian mode. It was a change in direction for them because this meant becoming resident schoolmasters. They did it and they found they were successful at it, and therefore they wanted to do more of it. Because they worked hard at it, I think because of the spiritual exercises, for one thing, they had a very clearly articulated and formulated sense of inner directedness, how crucial that was. And here they had now an institution that was something that was appropriate to the age in which they were living, and something they could do well, and something that was consonant with their spirituality, and indeed advanced their spirituality, gave it, you might almost say, a new mode.
When the first Jesuits started these institutions, they were really, I mean, they were really close to the experience. I mean, they were directly close to St. Ignatius. They, you know, had the experience of his passion, you know, and his insight. They were themselves filled with it, you know. I mean, they went everywhere, all around the world. I mean, they did really credible things to enact this and make it into an educational experience. But as time goes on, of course, and you get farther away from that, you have to find a way to kind of renew or plug into something that's way not even in your experience.
We're in a period of extraordinary transition. We're moving these institutions from being primarily Jesuit-run to being lay-run organizations where most of the faculty are lay people, where all of our institutions suffer from a lack of Jesuits. And how do we sustain the charism of these institutions in the absence of a critical mass of members of the Society of Jesus? I don't think any of us have really figured that out.
For hundreds of years, there's been a method to Jesuit education that, in its Latin translation, was referred to as the ratio studiorum, a kind of way of proceeding in Jesuit schools. When there were tons of Jesuits around to teach in the schools, we didn't have to think a whole lot about what it was that we did in sort of formulating that.
So with a lot of things going on at once, fewer Jesuits, more competition with secular institutions, a new level of professional commitment, all of those things, I think, made some of that accompaniment less and less available.
There's an international commission that was charged with researching this, and they came up with a document called The Characteristics of Jesuit Education that really looked back to see what are some of the things that this tradition has to offer, the types of person they're trying to educate, their worldview, their overall vision and hopes for working with students in an educational setting. A few years later, although educators really thought that was helpful, they wanted something more practical. And they wanted something like, what do I do in the classroom here and now?
And in 1993, we were able to come up with a model, a paradigm, if you will, called Ignatian Pedagogy, a practical approach.
The 5 parts of this Ignatian model are context, experience, reflection, action, and evaluation.
The first thing is that you need to understand who your students are. You can't do anything with them unless you know where they live, what matters to them, what excites them, inspires them, what troubles they experience. You got to know their world pretty well, and before you can give them anything, you've got to be there with them.
What we find in Ignatius is that he wants to meet with the person who wants to make the spiritual exercises, to find out their, what have they done so far? Do they know how to pray? Have they had crises in their lives? Are they in difficulty in some way? Are they open to real growth, etc., along the way? And then he makes a decision as to what kind of exercises he'll give them.
What are the influences that they've had? What are the experiences that we can presume that they know? What's the popular culture that they're exposed to and that they live out of? What are the presuppositions about life in the world that they bring?
I never forget that these students out there are real human beings who are going through joys and struggles and tragedies, and I don't let that be foreign to the classroom or foreign to the way in which I teach. I have to be aware of what they're going through, what they're struggling with.
Kids have got their exteriors, they've got their sense of who they are, sort of. They've got a lot of, masks that they're wearing. But they're kids underneath it, just like we all are. And they want to be loved. I want to be loved, So somehow I have to need to be able to tell them that and show them that. At the same time that I want to show them something about the world that I know, that might be of help to them when they go out of here.
Once we've established that context, that teacher is in a much better place to plan experiences in the classroom that are really going to set them on fire, really enliven them, capture their imagination.
I'm expecting probably more of a lecture style than I received in high school. Maybe not, hopefully not.
I like being able to have more of a conversation than a, talking at the students type thing. So I like the idea of being able to, really bounce ideas off each other and just get the ability to develop different talents that you have in the classroom.
Learning is so much more of the experience than just the reading, and the textbook lays it out for you. You can read books and books and books, know everything, but until you really experience it and you really dig down deep, that's learning to me.
I honestly don't know what to expect as of now.
In the spiritual exercises, the experience is when the person on retreat really engages using both their intellectual ability as well as their heart and their mind, their imagination, and as well as their feelings to enter into this experience of finding where God is calling them and deepening that relationship with God. In the classroom, the student does the work, which we would call experience, when they are doing the reading, when they're doing the homework assignments, when they're participating in class discussions on one level. And so there's an intellectual grasp of the material, and that's certainly all about experience. The other side of experience for Ignatian pedagogy, though, is also incorporating ways to hook the students, to get their imaginations connected to the material, to get their feelings connected to it.
When the course material is something that a faculty member lives with, and it comes out of their own personal experience, their own passion about how they've oriented themselves in the world, that's where I think the most powerful teaching takes place, and then the greatest opportunity for learning.
A good teacher teaches others how to love what he or she loves. And the reason you do it is because what you love is so important, and the people you're talking to are so important, that they deserve to find out about this all-important thing that you love.
You kind of forget sometimes you're teaching something, you get involved in the whole pattern of what educational life is all about, and it's about grades and who's turned in something and who's not, and who's getting away with something, and you start getting into this whole stuff, and you kind of feel like, wait a minute, what am I doing here? What is this all about? And there they are sitting in front of me, and sometimes I think, these are somebody's children. This is someone's boy and someone's girl, and they love them. They've loved them from the minute that they were conceived to this very day. No matter what they do, no matter how many times they screw up, they love them. And I think about that, and I think I have to love them like their parents do. Not in the same way exactly, but why else am I here? If I love them somehow, if they get that, maybe it'll be one piece of a whole pattern of other people doing this that empowers them to be the people that they're meant to be.
She was a very supportive person who took an interest in me as an individual, and who also, I don't want to say push, but really effectively encouraged me to think in ways that I hadn't thought before.
He was the first person who I think made clear to me that it was okay to do what I loved, even if what I loved was reading fiction.
In the spiritual exercises, there is the challenge of the director is to certainly help the retreatant find God. And they do that through a process of accompanying. They don't lead them directly to God. They just provide the opportunities, whether it's through conversations, questions, readings, prayers, for the student to kind of grapple directly with this relationship. And so they have a direct encounter with God in that way. In the classroom, the challenge is similar in the sense that the role of the teacher or faculty member is not to be the one with all the particular knowledge to give to the student, and they're just supposed to learn it and remember it and go. It's really to present opportunities for them to grapple with concepts, with ideas, give guidance where it's needed, but really to let them struggle with it in a way that they can own it and understand it in their terms.
It is the task of a good teacher to set that subject on its own 2 feet in the middle of the circle of inquiry in such a way that students have independent access to it, not simply through what the teacher says or what the text says, but through what the students themselves can learn and know and understand about it by coming into their own relationship with the subject.
The best teachers give students independent access to their subject, not okay, you have access to the subject through me. No, we all have access, equal access to it. I'm simply guiding you to it, and you'll go beyond me or take it in different directions than I.
We are supposed to be companions with them in their education. We're not really supposed to be, great wisdom givers. We're supposed to be with them, and they have as much an ability to reflect on some of these things as we do, and maybe even have something else to give that we don't.
But then the crucial step is the third step, which is reflection. And here we really ask questions about meaning. What is the meaning of what you're studying for your life?
Having had a class that they really liked or they were excited by, this experience that they've had, we want them then to take a step back and reflect on, well, what was it about that was so exciting? And also to get them thinking not merely about, well, why was it exciting for me, but what does this have to do with who I am and my place in the world?
I gave an assignment once where they had to watch 2 of the presidential debates and write a reflection on what we're learning in class. And of course, they all groaned during that when they first got the assignment. But afterwards, when they got it, one of the students told me at the end of the assignment, "Wow, I never knew theology could be relevant to real life." And I said, "Now you got it."
When students are able to make connections between the disciplines that they're studying to see what philosophy has to do with history, has to do with science, has to do with literary criticism, then there's there are those aha moments of discovery in seeing the connectedness and understanding what that has to do with my own life.
Now that they've learned this material in some way, shape, or form, they're asked to take some time and to go, well, what does it mean? What does it mean to me personally? If I care about it, how much do I care about it? And hopefully through a healthy educational process, they were encouraged to care because the faculty member knew about where the student's coming from, the context. They engaged them in experiences that tapped into maybe some of their emotional or affective abilities in order to say, yeah, you got me hooked here about this. I want to explore more about it.
This process of having these experiences and figuring out what we want to do with them is all part of this greater search for truth in our lives. The truth, first of all, about who we are and what is our purpose in the world and why we're here, and what are we going to do with our lives. Hopefully where we want to lead students is not only to become excited about a particular topic or a particular lesson in terms of how it affects themselves, but and what they like about it, but to get them motivated then to want to do something with what they've learned, and to sort of go out of the classroom into the world of action.
Action in the spiritual exercises and also in the classroom is really a response out of the care or love that the person has to do something. You could certainly have people do service projects and go and do things, and that's action on one hand, and they're meaningful and they're important and valuable. But in a deeper sense, after doing serious or significant reflection, there's a desire out of one's sense of self, out of one's love or care for whatever the need is, to respond in some way as generously as possible. Now that can be in going out and doing a service project. They can go out and be doing something else or changing a lifestyle. But it can also be simpler things like changing an attitude.
Ignatian spirituality is a way of looking at the world. It's a way of finding God in all things, and it's also a way of being, in a great phrase, a contemplative in action. It's the person who maintains a contemplative stance during a very busy life. So Ignatius's men originally weren't supposed to be stuck behind monastery walls. In fact, he asked for special permissions that the guys wouldn't have to gather, 7 or 8 times a day for prayer so that they could be out in the world doing things.
The goal of this would be to become other-centered, to become generous the way Jesus was generous.
I think our goal needs to be producing graduates who understand themselves fully and therefore understand how best they can serve the world.
I want a business student to walk out of Fairfield saying, yes, they learned the business curriculum, but they also have a concern for other people. And that transcends whatever their faith is, because as you know, we have Catholic as well as non-Catholic students at the undergraduate level and certainly at the graduate level.
For Ignatius does remind us in the spiritual exercises that love expresses itself more eloquently in deeds than in words.
You know what? There's millions and millions and millions of other people out there, many of whom are in no ways as lucky as you are. And what are you going to do when you leave here? if you go to a Jesuit school, you better not leave here for yourself only. You better leave here on this life adventure to engage with and support and help people who are way less fortunate than you are.
The fifth component of the Ignatian pedagogical paradigm is evaluation. It's this idea for the teacher to gain some evidence that students actually are actively processing and engaging with the material and profiting from it. Hopefully what would be great would be for the students to be able to step back and look at where they were at the beginning of the semester and kind of marvel at where they are at the end of the semester, to kind of set them continuing to ask themselves, okay, so I've come this far, now what? What else is there to learn? What other things about myself are there to discover? What other things are there about life that I was just never aware of before that I can learn about?
Certainly in the spiritual life, what you want is an interiorization of values and a deepening of motivation. And to apply this then to the schooling situation, what's important is that the system turn out people who are self-motivated, who are in touch with themselves. They're inner-directed, to use a somewhat old-fashioned word, but still a very good word, inner-directed. And that if you do this, then you've really accomplished a tremendous piece of what education is all about.
Part of the challenge of being a teacher in a Jesuit school is to practice what we preach, as it were, so that not only do we want our students to, actively reflect on what they've learned and what excites them, and then to go and do something with that in the world, but ideally we should be modeling that for them. And of course, it should go beyond just the individual teachers, and it should be part of the atmosphere and the environment of the institution itself.
Do we really believe that these attributes of attention and reverence and devotion are so important that we're willing to make them part of the criterion for hiring and part of the criterion for promotion and part of the criterion for merit increases?
I think generally what the Jesuit institution is going to be an institution held together by a set of creative balances. Interest in the student, interest in research, solid teaching, and commitment to the common good. Those are kind of elements in it. And I think we're going to have to find a new way of computing how these elements come together.
Jesuit colleges and universities have a chance to be explicit about the values that brought them into existence and that keep them going and that are important in the world and that need to be heard.
As the world and our lives become more and more fragmented, I think we offer something that a lot of other places don't and won't, if we choose to really embrace it. And I think it will be a wonderful gift to many, many, many people.
And I'm very hopeful about it. I think it's going to be clumsy and we'll make mistakes, and people will ask questions about what we're doing. But I think there is a desire on just a tremendous influx of wonderful lay women and men to really be Ignatian.
It's now up to us to ensure that this tradition is sustained and has an enduring capacity that we all share and that we all play a role in trying to sustain.
And I suggest that in our world, in our time, in our cities, in our departments, in our universities, that we ponder this reality, this tradition, ancient yet ever new, the vocation to educate in the Ignatian tradition.